the red folder. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the doors of Clarence House were locked from the inside. No press office. No smiling equerries. No ceremony. Just a red-stamped leather folder placed at the center of a polished mahogany table. Confidential. Domestic action. The men standing around it had served the crown for decades. They had survived divorce wars, abdication shadows, constitutional tremors, and public fury. Something in the air felt different. Heavier. When King Charles III entered the room, the silence shifted. He was not the composed sovereign the public had seen days earlier, shaking hands and smiling for cameras. His shoulders were slightly stooped. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though the air itself resisted him. He did not greet the room. He sat, and for a moment, he simply stared at the folder. 8 days earlier, that file had been delivered under the highest classification available to the royal household. It had not passed through standard channels. It had not been logged in the usual registry. It had come directly to him. Inside it was not an affair, not a financial crime, not a tabloid exaggeration. It was something far more destabilizing. A detailed intelligence briefing alleging that members of Queen Camilla's inner circle had been orchestrating calculated media positioning. Strategic leaks designed to elevate her public image at the quiet expense of other senior royals, including the king himself, including his sons. The report suggested influence campaigns, subtle but deliberate, manipulating press narratives during sensitive family moments. It wasn't scandal in the traditional sense. It was erosion. And for a man who believed the monarchy survived on unity and discipline, erosion was betrayal. Charles had spent more than 3 decades defending Camilla against public hostility. He had endured global criticism, internal palace resistance, even strain within his own family, all to ensure she would one day stand beside him as queen. He had gambled his legacy on that loyalty. Now he was being told that while he was fighting to stabilize the crown during illness and public doubt, someone within his own household had been playing a different game. The king finally spoke. His voice was low, not angry, not theatrical, controlled, but strained. This has become untenable. No one in the room interrupted. They understood the weight of that word. Untenable did not mean argument. It did not mean temporary strain. It meant structural collapse. For several seconds, the only sound was the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted above the fireplace, a relic older than the American Constitution. Then came the sentence none of them had prepared for. I intend to separate from the Queen. There was no dramatic slam of the table. No raised voice. Just quiet devastation. Because this was not merely a marital fracture. This would be the first separation of a sitting British sovereign in modern constitutional history. The last time a reigning monarch shattered marital tradition at this level, the consequences reshaped the empire. The advisors exchanged brief glances, not of shock, but calculation. They understood immediately what this meant. Constitutional scrutiny, parliamentary whispers, media frenzy, market tremors, Commonwealth uncertainty. The monarchy was already fragile. The king was undergoing cancer treatment. Public trust hovered on a knife's edge. And now, internal fracture. Charles clasped his hands tightly, steadying their tremor. The institution must survive, he said quietly. That sentence clarified everything. This was not about heartbreak. It was containment. He had reached a conclusion that few monarchs ever admit aloud. Sometimes the threat to the crown does not come from outside protesters or foreign governments. Sometimes it comes from within the gates. But while this domestic detonation was being prepared in silence, another problem, older, darker, and far more volatile, was gathering momentum across the Atlantic. And this time, it would not stay private. 4 days earlier, early review copies of a memoir had begun circulating among journalists in New York. The title was simple, Nobody's Girl. The author was no longer alive. Virginia Giuffre. Her final testimony. Her unfiltered account. And within its pages, Prince Andrew's name appeared not as rumor, but as narrative center. The timing was catastrophic. Because while Charles was preparing to fracture his own marriage to preserve institutional integrity, The Duke of York was about to ignite a firestorm that would make private separation look like a footnote. Inside the Clarence House study, the king's private secretary leaned forward carefully. "Your Majesty," he said, choosing each word like a stepping stone across ice. "If the Andrew matter escalates simultaneously, public perception may merge both crises." Charles closed his eyes briefly. He already understood. If separation was interpreted as weakness, and Andrew's scandal reignited, the narrative would not be reform. It would be collapse. And perception, in monarchy, is oxygen. Without it, nothing survives. The red folder on the table was only the first domino. Because beyond those oak doors, history was accelerating. Within 2 weeks, a memoir would top global charts. A funeral would produce a viral 7-second clip. A private estate in Windsor would become a battlefield. And the heir to the throne would step forward, not emotionally, but strategically. Prince William had been watching. Silently, coldly. He believed the monarchy could not drift any longer. It needed decisive correction. And if his father hesitated, William would not. But on that gray September morning, none of that had unfolded yet. There was only a trembling king, a red folder, and the recognition that loyalty, the one currency he believed he could count on, might no longer exist inside his own walls. Charles rose slowly from his chair. "Prepare the legal framework," he said. "No emotion. No hesitation. Discretion above all else." As the doors reopened and the advisors filtered out into separate corridors to begin quiet consultations, one thing was clear. The House of Windsor had entered a new phase. Protection was over. Preservation would now require sacrifice. And somewhere in America, a manuscript was about to make that sacrifice unavoidable. This was not the beginning of scandal. It was the beginning of restructuring. And in the coming days, one royal name would be erased so clinically that it would send a message across oceans. No one is untouchable anymore. The memoir that changed everything. The manuscript was released at midnight. By 12:07 a.m., it had already broken through the top 10 on Amazon. By sunrise, it was #1 globally. Nobody's Girl. The final testimony of Virginia Giuffre. And unlike previous interviews or court filings, this was not defensive. It was personal, raw, structured, unfiltered. There would be no cross-examination, no legal counters, no palace statement that could soften it. The words were printed, bound, permanent. And inside those pages, Prince Andrew was not mentioned cautiously. He was described in detail. The first chapter that referenced him did not begin with accusation. It began with atmosphere. A London townhouse. A whispered introduction. A forced smile. Then came the sentence that would detonate British public opinion. "He knew how old I was." That line alone fractured years of denial strategy. 4 years, the palace position had relied on ambiguity, distance, and controlled silence. But ambiguity collapses when specificity enters the room. Within hours, British morning radio shows shifted tone. By noon, major broadsheets had deployed full editorial columns. Not speculative, not cautious, definitive. This was no longer a lingering scandal. It was moral gravity. The public reaction was not loud at first. It was cold, measured, and that made it more dangerous. Because outrage fades, disgust calcifies. Across social media, one phrase began trending: enough protection. For the first time in decades, there was no appetite for royal shielding, no patience for gradual resolution, no sympathy. Inside Clarence House, the king was briefed every 2 hours. His medical team had advised rest. Rest was impossible. The polling data was worse than expected, not because people were shocked, but because they were tired. The monarchy, many felt, had asked for too much grace for too long. Now they wanted correction. Prince Andrew, meanwhile, issued a carefully structured statement. Voluntary relinquishment of public duties. Continued denial. Appeal to fairness. It read like crisis management from 2002. But it was 2025, and the environment had changed. The younger generation did not interpret silence as dignity. They interpreted it as avoidance. By the third day, one number began circulating in Westminster corridors. 78%. That was the percentage of respondents who supported stripping Andrew of remaining titles. Not suspending. Not distancing. Stripping. Prince William saw the data before his father did. He requested a private audience that same evening. There were no advisors present. No aides. Just father and son. William did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He spoke like a future executive addressing a failing division. This cannot continue. Charles listened without interruption. William continued. The monarchy does not survive by loyalty to individuals. It survives by loyalty to standards. It was not an attack. It was positioning. William understood something Charles struggled with emotionally. Every day Andrew remained semi-protected was a day the institution looked compromised. And perception, once lost, is nearly impossible to recover. The conversation lasted 43 minutes. When William left the room, palace staff noticed something subtle. The king looked older, not physically weaker, but resigned. Because what William was asking required something Charles had avoided his entire life. Public finality. 4 days later, attention shifted from headlines to property. Royal Lodge. 30 rooms. Secluded grounds. Echoes of the Queen Mother. But beneath its stately exterior, internal inspection reports told another story. Severe damp. Structural decay. Deferred maintenance. The lease Andrew had secured in 2003 required him to maintain the property at his expense. He had not. The numbers were staggering. Millions in required restoration. And no clear funding source. To Charles, this was no longer personal embarrassment. It was symbolic decay. A disgraced royal occupying a deteriorating estate while the monarchy preached fiscal responsibility. The optics were lethal. A discreet letter was sent. Formal request to vacate. The response stunned even seasoned palace negotiators. Andrew did not negotiate quietly. He countered. Reports from inside the discussions described a list of demands that bordered on delusion. Financial settlement, rumored near $99 million. Guaranteed private staff. Driver. Gardener. Full police protection. Continuation of lifestyle parity. In Andrew's mind, this was not entitlement. It was restitution. He believed he had sacrificed reputation in service of the institution. He believed he was owed insulation. But the public no longer saw sacrifice. They saw consequence. As negotiations stalled, a second detonator exploded. A funeral. The Duchess of Kent. Somber. Measured. Traditional. And then, 7 seconds. 7 seconds of footage showing Andrew smiling, leaning towards Sarah Ferguson, appearing amused. It was nothing, and it was everything. Within hours, the clip surpassed 2 million views. The caption that spread fastest read, "Still laughing." That was the moment William decided waiting was no longer an option. He requested another meeting. This time, Princess Anne joined. Anne's position was even firmer. Duty above sentiment. Always. The conversation inside Clarence House that evening was not emotional. It was strategic. 3 conclusions emerged. Andrew would never self-correct. Incremental distancing was no longer effective. Institutional survival required visible boundary enforcement. Charles understood the cost. This would not just humiliate a brother. It would set precedent. A reigning monarch publicly dismantling the status of a sibling. The last comparable event had been 1936. And that shadow still lingered. But times had changed. Modern monarchy survives not through mystique, but through adaptation. The next morning, the legal team was instructed to review letters' patent authority. The mechanism rarely used. Quiet. Powerful. By late October, draft language was prepared. Clinical. Precise. Irreversible. Meanwhile, Andrew remained inside Royal Lodge, refusing to pack, insisting legal rights protected him. But legal rights do not override sovereign authority when precedent is invoked. On October 30th, Buckingham Palace released a statement that was only 4 paragraphs long. No emotional language, no apology, no condemnation, just execution. Prince Andrew would no longer use HRH. Military titles removed. Official representation terminated. Reference style adjusted. He would be known, in formal capacity, as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The erasure was surgical. Within hours, public reaction surged. Not outrage. Approval. The monarchy, for the first time in years, looked decisive. Polling numbers stabilized. Editorial tone shifted from frustration to cautious respect. William said nothing publicly. He didn't need to. The message was clear. A new operational philosophy had begun. Protection was conditional. Privilege was conditional. Bloodline was conditional. But what no one yet realized was that the Andrew precedent would not stop at Windsor. Across the Atlantic, in Montecito, the news was being watched closely. And very carefully. Because if one royal title could disappear with a signature, others could too. And that realization would trigger a quiet panic far from London. The precedent. 5,000 miles away from London's grey skyline, the California sun was relentless. Inside a gated estate in Montecito, screens flickered with the same headline playing on repeat across the Atlantic. Andrew stripped of royal status. The statement from Buckingham Palace was only a few paragraphs long. But to Prince Harry and Meghan, it felt seismic. Because what the world saw as accountability, they saw as precedent. For the first time in modern royal history, a reigning monarch had not simply distanced himself from scandal. He had erased rank. Titles removed. Style removed. Institutional identity recalibrated. It was not symbolic. It was structural. And that changed everything. Harry had spent his entire life understanding that royal status was layered, complicated, but ultimately permanent. Yes, duties could be withdrawn. Yes, public roles could shift. But bloodline, that was immutable. Or so he had believed. Now, the rules felt rewritten. And the timing could not have been worse. Their relationship with the royal family was already fragile, fractured by interviews, documentaries, memoirs, and televised grievances. They had agreed to stop using HRH in official capacity, but they had retained their Duke and Duchess titles. Those titles were not decorative. They were currency. They were branding. They were leverage in media negotiations, corporate partnerships, and political introductions. Without them, they were simply celebrities. And California was overflowing with celebrities. Within hours of the Andrew announcement, emergency conversations began. Not public, not dramatic, strategic. Advisors were consulted. Brand managers ran risk projections. Legal experts quietly reviewed parliamentary mechanisms surrounding peerage revocation. One question dominated every conversation. If Charles can remove Andrew's princely status, what stops him from removing a dukedom? The legal landscape was murky. Removing a princely style through letters patent was within sovereign authority. But revoking a peerage, a dukedom, would require parliamentary cooperation. Possible, but politically sensitive. Still, something had shifted. Because this was no longer about what had been done. It was about what could now be imagined. Harry understood his father's emotional complexity. Charles was cautious, sentimental, conflict-averse. But William was different. William saw monarchy as an institution, not a family shelter. And William would one day be king. That reality hung heavily in Montecito, because the Andrew decision had not emerged from Charles alone. Insiders whispered what palace observers already suspected. William had pushed. Firmly. Privately. Decisively. And if William had no hesitation in pressing his father to dismantle Andrew's remaining status, what restraint would he show toward a brother who had publicly criticized him? The fear was not immediate action. It was long-term inevitability. If public opinion continued to favor institutional slimming, if polling continued to reward decisive correction, if the Charles precedent became normalized, then succession would not soften that trend. It would accelerate it. Meanwhile, in Britain, commentary evolved. This was no longer just about Andrew. Editorial pages began discussing a modern monarchy reset. Fewer working royals, clearer accountability, reduced taxpayer burden. In that framework, the Sussex model, royal titles without royal duty, began to look increasingly contradictory. The British public, already fatigued by years of royal drama, showed little appetite for nuance. To them, the principle was simple. If Andrew could lose status for damaging the institution, why should others keep theirs while criticizing it? That sentiment did not dominate headlines, but it simmered quietly. And Harry knew something else. He knew William had not forgotten. Not the interviews, not the accusations, not the insinuations about family dynamics, not the public challenges to Catherine. William rarely responded publicly. But silence, in his case, was not surrender. It was memory. Back in Windsor, Andrew's removal created ripple effects inside palace walls. Staff were reassigned. Portraits quietly relocated. Official biographies updated. The recalibration was methodical. No chaos. No spectacle. Just quiet erasure. And that methodical efficiency made one thing clear. This process had been planned carefully, which meant if it were ever applied again, it would not be improvised. In Montecito, strategy discussions shifted from defensive to preemptive. Should public tone soften? Should reconciliation signals increase? Should projects emphasize charitable alignment rather than criticism? The irony was stark. In seeking independence, they had positioned themselves as external commentators. But now, their security depended on internal restraint. The Andrew decision had redrawn psychological boundaries. And there was another factor: money. Royal Lodge had symbolized excess and entitlement. The king's decision to enforce financial consequence had been popular. If public appetite leaned toward austerity and accountability, would voters support parliamentary debate about inherited titles used commercially overseas? It was no longer unthinkable. The monarchy survives on narrative control. And suddenly, narrative momentum favored discipline. As October progressed, internal polling suggested approval ratings for Charles had stabilized. More strikingly, William's numbers surged. Younger voters who had been indifferent began expressing renewed interest in a streamlined monarchy. That data was not lost on anyone, because every institution evolves toward what rewards it. If decisive pruning rewarded the crown, pruning would continue. The Sussex household remained outwardly calm. Public appearances did not shift dramatically. Statements remained measured. But insiders described an unmistakable change. Urgency. Because while Andrew's fall was dramatic, it was contained. The true impact was conceptual. He had been a prince by birth. Now he was not. That single fact rewired assumptions across the royal orbit. Titles were no longer guarantees. They were conditional. Conditional on conduct, conditional on alignment, conditional on institutional preservation. And William, watching from Windsor, understood something even deeper. The monarchy had just tested its own authority. And it had worked. There had been no constitutional crisis, no mass protest, no parliamentary revolt. Instead, there had been approval. That validation matters. Because once power is exercised successfully, it becomes easier to exercise again. Back inside Clarence House, Charles appeared quieter. Not relieved. Not triumphant. Just resolved. The Andrew chapter had cost him personally. But it had bought the institution breathing room. Yet another issue loomed. not across the Atlantic, but closer. Because while Montecito calculated risk, and Andrew retreated into isolation, the monarchy was about to face a test not of scandal, but of perception. A 7-second clip had already caused tremors. What would happen when the next public misstep collided with this new zero-tolerance climate? The rules had changed. The age of automatic protection was over. The age of visible accountability had begun. And in that environment, every royal movement mattered. Every appearance, every word, every association. Because once the crown proves it can cut one branch, all other branches begin measuring their own stability. The reset. When the statement stripping Andrew of status was released, the public saw punishment. What they didn't see was preparation. Because the decision had not been reactive. It had been strategic. 4 months, quietly, internal reviews had been underway. Budget allocations, public approval data, engagement efficiency, security cost evaluations, working royal output versus expense. The monarchy was being audited, not by Parliament, by itself. Prince William had been studying those numbers carefully. He understood something his father had struggled to fully embrace. The monarchy no longer survives on mystique. It survives on measurable value. In private briefings, one phrase began appearing repeatedly: operational sustainability. That phrase marked the shift. This was no longer about managing scandal. This was about redesigning the firm. Historically, the British monarchy had relied on a broad ecosystem of working royals, cousins, uncles, secondary branches. That structure provided visibility, coverage, and ceremonial continuity. But it also created risk. The more individuals attached to the institution, the more variables could fracture it. And the public mood had shifted. Younger voters did not romanticize extended privilege. They demanded justification. William saw the trajectory clearly. If the monarchy was to survive into the next 50 years, it had to shrink before it was forced to shrink. The Andrew removal was not the end. It was the first structural cut. Inside Windsor, planning accelerated. A future model began taking shape. The King, the Queen, the Prince and Princess of Wales, their children, in time. A limited supporting structure. Everything else would orbit, but not define. Princess Anne, respected for her work ethic and minimal drama, remained stabilizing. But generationally, the focus was narrowing. The public would be encouraged to see monarchy not as a sprawling dynasty, but as a tight leadership unit. Less spectacle, more discipline, less entitlement, more service. That narrative shift required visible action. Andrew had provided the catalyst, but William intended to institutionalize the precedent. In closed-door discussions, he emphasized 3 principles. No more reputational shielding. No more ambiguous roles. Clear consequences for institutional damage. The Charles precedent was evolving into something sharper. The William standard. Even before ascending the throne, William's influence was palpable. Engagement schedules were recalibrated. Public messaging was streamlined. Appearances became more targeted: healthcare, veterans, climate innovation, early childhood development. No unnecessary visibility. No tabloid bait. The contrast was intentional. While Andrew's past behavior had embodied indulgence, the Wales household projected restraint. Polling data reinforced the strategy. Approval ratings for William and Catherine climbed steadily. They were viewed as stable, professional, modern, but not disruptive. And that balance mattered. Because monarchy must appear both timeless and adaptable. Too rigid, and it fractures. Too rebellious, and it destabilizes. William walked the middle path carefully. Meanwhile, Andrew's relocation negotiations dragged on. Royal Lodge stood increasingly isolated. Maintenance issues worsened. Financial pressure mounted. The public interest waned, but the symbolism remained. A rotting estate housing a diminished prince. The metaphor was too clean to ignore. Eventually, a quiet compromise was reached. No $99 million settlement. No royal-funded luxury. A scaled-down residence. Reduced staff. Private financial responsibility. Not exile, but unmistakable downgrade. Andrew's identity had shifted permanently, and that shift sent a signal far beyond Windsor. Because institutions do not demonstrate power casually. When they do, they intend to normalize it. Across Britain, commentary evolved from scandal to reform. Opinion pieces framed the moment as the necessary pruning. Historians drew parallels not to collapse, but to consolidation periods in previous centuries. The monarchy was not imploding. It was tightening. And in that tightening, hierarchy clarified. Charles remained monarch, but William increasingly looked like operator. That dynamic was subtle, respectful, but undeniable. The heir was shaping the reign before inheriting it. Inside palace corridors, a new internal guideline began circulating informally. No gray zones. Gray zones had allowed Andrew to linger, had allowed Sussex ambiguity, had allowed press speculation. Clarity would now be favored over comfort. The Sussex household felt this shift acutely, because ambiguity had been their operating space. Half in, half out. Royal, but not royal. Now that space was shrinking. Parliamentary murmurs about peerage reform surfaced quietly. Nothing formal. Nothing immediate. But the possibility was now discussable. And once something becomes discussable in British politics, it becomes plausible. William understood that long-term stability required not emotional reconciliation, but structural boundaries. If the monarchy became too flexible, it would dissolve into celebrity culture. If it remained too rigid, it would fracture under modern scrutiny. So the reset focused on precision, reduced footprint, elevated standards, measured visibility. The next generation, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince Louis, were being shielded carefully. Minimal exposure, controlled appearances. William had watched what uncontrolled visibility did to Harry. He would not repeat that model. Protection would now mean privacy, not indulgence. As November approached, the palace began quietly reshaping internal staffing. Advisors with aggressive media tendencies were replaced with strategic planners. Crisis response units were streamlined. Data analysis expanded. The monarchy was beginning to function more like a modern executive office than a ceremonial relic. Critics argued it felt colder. Supporters argued it felt stronger. Both were correct. Because strength in institutions often requires emotional detachment. The final symbolic act of Part 4 came quietly. A revised royal website update. Andrew's biography reduced. Titles adjusted. References minimized. No announcement. No headline. Just history rewritten digitally. Erasure in the modern age does not require bonfires. It requires edits. And that edit signaled finality. But even as the institution stabilized, one unpredictable variable remained. Public memory. Because while Andrew's removal satisfied many, the broader question lingered. If accountability was now the standard, would it be applied universally? And that question would soon test the monarchy again. Not through scandal, not through memoir, but through something smaller, more subtle, and potentially more explosive. Because sometimes institutions are not undone by major events, but by minor moments that reveal inconsistency. And the next 7 seconds of royal footage would test whether this reset was permanent or selective. The erasure. It wasn't the memoir. It wasn't the negotiations. It wasn't even the titles. In the end, it was 7 seconds. 7 seconds filmed outside St. George's Chapel. While the royal family stood in rigid silence at the Duchess of Kent's funeral, Prince Andrew leaned toward Sarah Ferguson and smiled. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But in the digital age, perception doesn't need context. It needs contrast. And the contrast was devastating. Within hours, the clip had circulated across every major platform. Commentators dissected body language. Headlines sharpened their tone. The phrase, "tone deaf," appeared again and again. To the public, it wasn't about grief protocol. It was about awareness. Or rather, the absence of it. Inside Clarence House, that clip landed harder than the memoir had. Because the memoir was history. This was present. William watched it once. Then twice. Then turned off the screen. "This ends now," he reportedly said. That evening, a final private meeting was called. No advisors. No aides. Just the king, the heir, and Princess Anne. The discussion was no longer theoretical. Andrew had been given space. He had been given time. He had been given discretion. And still, miscalculation. Anne's voice was direct. The institution cannot absorb another cycle. Charles did not argue. He looked tired. Not politically exhausted. Emotionally. Because this was no longer about public management. It was about blood. Andrew was not a distant cousin. He was his brother. They had grown up together under the shadow of expectation, under the discipline of Queen Elizabeth II, under the strict codes of royal survival. But monarchy does not recognize nostalgia. It recognizes continuity. And continuity requires pruning. By the following morning, the legal framework was activated. Letters patent had already stripped Andrew of his style and military honors. Now the final administrative closures began. Official patronages permanently reassigned. Security status reclassified. Residential downgrade confirmed. Internal communications amended to remove remaining ceremonial references. The shift was not dramatic. It was clinical. And that made it final. Royal Lodge would no longer be defended. Maintenance responsibility would fall entirely on Andrew. If he failed to meet conditions, the lease would not be renewed under favorable terms. The era of negotiation was over. In public, Buckingham Palace released a short, tightly worded statement. It contained no condemnation, no sympathy, just confirmation of structural adjustments in the interest of institutional stability. The phrase was deliberate. Institutional stability. Not family harmony. Not personal hardship. Stability. The response from the public was swift and telling. Approval ratings for the monarchy ticked upward. Commentators who had criticized Charles for hesitation now described him as decisive. William's standing rose even further. The reset had held. But something deeper had changed. For the first time in modern royal history, the crown had demonstrated that proximity to power did not guarantee immunity from consequence. That message traveled far beyond Windsor. In Montecito, it was studied carefully. Because Andrew's fall had proven something undeniable. Royal identity was not permanent. It was conditional. And if the standard now prioritized institutional protection over personal comfort, no branch was immune. Meanwhile, Andrew retreated from visibility. No grand exit. No emotional statement. Just quiet relocation. A former prince reduced to private citizen styling. The symbolism was stark. The monarchy had cut one of its own limbs, and survived. That survival reinforced authority. But it also introduced a new era. An era where discipline would replace discretion. An era where internal missteps would not be shielded indefinitely. An era shaped not only by Charles's sentiment, but by William's strategy. Because if this was the rehearsal, the real transformation would occur when the heir ascends. The Charles precedent may have begun this chapter. But history will likely remember it as the moment the House of Windsor chose survival over sentiment. And that choice changes dynasties. The forest had been pruned. The rot removed. But pruning creates awareness. Every remaining branch now knows it can be cut. And in that awareness lies both strength and fear. The monarchy has entered a colder phase. Leaner, sharper, less forgiving. The age of automatic protection is over. The age of earned legitimacy has begun, and the next test may not come from scandal, but from within the very generation meant to inherit the throne. Because once an institution proves it can erase a prince, it will never be viewed the same again. So now the question isn't just about Andrew. It's about precedent. Did King Charles make the right decision, choosing the crown over his own brother? Or has the monarchy crossed into a colder, more ruthless era where blood no longer guarantees loyalty? And if this is how a prince can fall, what happens when the next crisis involves someone closer to the throne? Tell me what you think. Was this necessary reform or irreversible fracture? Drop your perspective below. I read the top comments personally. And if you want to understand where this reset could lead next, click the video on your screen. Because the next chapter in this royal transformation may be even more dramatic than the one we just witnessed. Subscribe and stay inside the story. The crown is changing, and history is watching.